What's up, and welcome back to Gabe Miller Music. This is my comparison between the Novation Circuit Tracks and Novation Circuit Rhythm. A bunch of you have been asking for this, and so has Novation. They're sponsoring this video. They wanted it to be clear to people what they're getting into should they decide to get a device. But I should be clear, I am not trying to sell you either device. I'm simply trying to inform you what you're getting into, and Novation didn't even ask to have any direction over the content of this video. All the opinions and analysis are completely my own, and I place a really high value on getting to say whatever I want, even when working with brands. All that being said, let's jump into it. All right, so here are both circuits, and the thing you'll probably immediately notice is that a lot of these buttons and a lot of this layout is pretty much identical. Down this side, you've got patterns on both circuits, mixer, effects, and access to sidechain, recording, play, obviously, similar pattern settings, similar options for probability, similar options for gate and microsteps. We'll get into all that in a little bit. Velocity, and then with note, they start to diverge a little bit. I'll get into that. And we've got preset on the tracks and sample on the circuit rhythm. And this brings us to the fundamental biggest difference between these two devices. The circuit tracks works from a combination of synth patches and samples. The circuit rhythm is samples only. And there are some differences in the way that samples behave that might make the circuit rhythm better or worse for you depending on what you're trying to do. So let's get into synth patches first on the circuit tracks. The circuit tracks has two synth tracks that operate off of Novation's MiniNova sound engine. It's pretty versatile. It can do some vintage stuff, some super gritty modern stuff as well. And it's fully customizable via the components editor. So you can design synth patches entirely from scratch, or you can download synth patches that other people have made, load them onto here, and then go from there. And you do that by selecting the preset. So you'll probably find yourself doing the majority of your melodies and bass lines and chord progressions and all that kind of stuff within the synth tracks. And those can be sidechained to the drum tracks, which operate entirely off of samples. And here's the beauty of a thing that both circuits can do when it comes to samples, is a feature called sample flip. Sample flip allows you to switch between multiple samples on the same track, so long as they don't overlap. So let me just show you that. I've got this kick. Let's say I want to add a snare. So let me lock this sample, as indicated by it being purple. So just do a dumb little pattern here. That's all living on one track, and it's switching between those two samples, and that was pretty easy to set up. That sounds a little silly, but hopefully you get the idea. And that leaves these other three sample tracks free. The Novation Circuit Rhythm can do the exact same thing. You can switch between all these samples over the course of one track. Except on the circuit rhythm, every single one of these tracks is a sample track. And in addition to that, the circuit rhythm adds a really important feature for dealing with samples that the tracks doesn't have. And that is mapping a sound to a keyboard. So let me switch to a different sound, like this bass sound. I can just select the sounds as normal, and then I can go to note, map that to a keyboard, which you unfortunately can't do on the circuit tracks. I would love to see that implemented in a firmware update if possible, but so far, that's one distinction that they're making between these two devices, is chromatic sample playing. In terms of processing the samples, there is some overlap, and then they do diverge a bit. For instance, you have similar distortion on both devices, which I quite like. I quite like the way this distortion sounds. You've got a way to control the tuning in general. The difference being on the circuit rhythm, if you hold down shift, it will lock your tuning to a chromatic scale so that you can really dial in your tuning without having to just do it by ear. Whereas on here, that tuning is just continuous, and you just kind of got to dial it in by ear. There are also functions on the circuit rhythm that have been kind of broken out from what's on the circuit tracks. Let me show you what I mean. Got this hi-hat here. If I turn this knob, it'll shorten the sound. So it's controlling its envelope, its amp envelope, but only in one direction. And you can do the same on here with length, in conjunction with slope. But it can also go the other way. Here it's cutting off the beginning. So that gives you some extra room to really manipulate your samples. Similar deal with the filter. That's cutting lows, that's cutting highs, and that's just all living on this one knob, whereas on the circuit rhythm, they actually broke those out. So you've got a high pass filter to cut the lows, and a low pass filter to cut the highs. Having these separate is actually really nice, not only as a sound design tool, but as a mixing tool. I often find myself going in and just scooping out unnecessary low end, which helps me get a bit of a cleaner mix, and that's a bit of an unintended bonus feature of having the filters here. It helps you dial in a cleaner mix. That's a lot of information that I just threw at you, so let me quickly condense it down to the bare bones of what you need to know. The circuit tracks works off of 2 synth tracks and 4 sample tracks. And these sample tracks can't do as much as the sample tracks on the circuit rhythm can do. The circuit rhythm has 8 sample tracks, and they start with the basis of how the circuit tracks sample tracks behave, but they add extra features like mapping stuff to a keyboard and more control over your sound, which is super nice to have. One unfortunate restriction that we're still stuck with on the circuit rhythm for dealing with samples is the fact that you can only play one sound at a time. You may have noticed when playing that bass sound that it rings out, and that each successive sound cuts off the previous one. No way to change that. It's only monophonic. You can only play one note at a time. I should mention, though, you can change how the samples behave. So there's also gated. So if I hold this down, it'll play. If I let it go, it'll stop immediately. And then you can even do stuff like reverse samples. There's also the sample slicer, which the circuit tracks does not have, but I'm going to come back to that because I mentioned how the circuit rhythm can only play one note at a time on each track. Not the case for the circuit tracks. Because it's running its own polyphonic synth engine, you can play chords. No problem. Can't do that on the circuit rhythm. If you want to play chords on the circuit rhythm, you have to sample stuff playing chords into it. And I'll get into sampling in a bit here. But basically, if you want chords, you're not going to just play them in. You're going to have to be a little more creative. Whereas on here, you have that freedom with this synth engine that is polyphonic. The same goes for the 2 MIDI tracks, and I'm going to get back to these when we get into connectivity in a second. But at this point, hopefully you're starting to have a picture emerge of which one of these might fit your approach to making music a little bit better. With the circuit tracks, you are locked into the synth engine that it has built in, but you get what is a pretty good synth engine and polyphony and more evolving sounds. Depending on what's mapped to these macro knobs, you can have a sound that really evolves over time, and you can have a lot of control over it. So if you want something to sound a little more organic, a little more evolving, and of course, if building chords to start a song every time are the way you really like to work, the circuit tracks is probably already looking more appealing. However, if you want to be able to just drag in any sound and use it as if it's a synth, the circuit rhythm's probably starting to look more appealing. For me personally, in my own personal opinion, I like having the unlimited sound palette that just a pure sampler gives me. I like being able to just drag in whatever sound I want, no matter what it was made with, and then just have it available for me to play. These 2 approaches to working with sounds also unlock some different possibilities for building full sounding tracks. On the circuit rhythm, you've got 8 tracks to work with, so I often love to throw in a bunch of different layers, all kind of doing something a little bit different and kind of interweaving, and that's how I get a full sounding track, even if I don't always have chords going or if my chord choice is a little bit more restricted. On the circuit tracks, you have fewer tracks to work with, But because of the synth tracks being polyphonic, you can often have a sound to pull double duty. So you might play bass and chords on one patch, leaving the other patch free for a melody or something like that. I did that a ton with the original circuit, and I still do that a ton with the circuit tracks, although it's less necessary because of the MIDI tracks. Once again, we're going to get to connectivity in a little bit. The other major feature that the Rhythm adds in terms of working with samples is the sample chop feature. So let me show you how that works very quickly. I've shown this in a couple other videos. I go to sample mode, slice, select how many slices I want, and then I can actually go in. It's like a lazy chop feature, like you'd see on an MPC. And then I can dial in those chops from there or redo it or whatever else. That's super nice to have. The tracks can't do that. Novation definitely seems to be targeting slightly different but overlapping demographics. If you are a more synth-focused producer and really love working with synth patches and tweaking them and having polyphony, the circuit tracks is starting to look more appealing to you, especially if you like working with external synths as well. We'll get to that just in a second here. The circuit rhythm might look more appealing to you if you love chopping samples or using a very sample-focused workflow. And for me personally, I fall somewhere in the middle. Of course, I would love to see a Circuit Pro that combines the best features of both of these, but I do often go to the circuit rhythm even if I want to make something that's a little less of a beat, if that makes sense. Like, the stereotypical producers would be like a synthwave or progressive house producer on the circuit tracks, and then a hip hop or trap producer on the circuit rhythm. You can absolutely make hip hop and trap on the circuit tracks. You can absolutely make more evolving electronic music like synthwave or progressive house on the circuit rhythm. And of course, those are super limited genres. You can do a lot on both of these. You're going to have to work within both their strengths and limitations either way, but hopefully you're starting to see which one might be right for you if you choose to go with one. A couple of other odds and ends while I'm thinking about it before we get into connectivity, which is the other huge fundamental difference between these two devices. Sidechain is very similar on these devices, but on the circuit rhythm, you can sidechain any sample track to any other sample track, and that goes for all 8 tracks. On the circuit tracks, you can only sidechain synth tracks to sample tracks. You can't sidechain sample tracks to each other. Also, on the rhythm, you are locked to a chromatic scale if you're playing stuff across a keyboard. That's all you get. Can't change it. On the circuit tracks, you have that chromatic mode available to you, but you also have a bunch of other scales and modes to work with. And you can choose a bunch of these and put that into any key as well. That's super nice to have. Circuit Rhythm can't do that. Another feature that the Rhythm adds beneath Mixer here, you'll notice that extra little bit of text. That's the grid effects, which are kind of live performance effects to kind of mess up the beat and make it a little more interesting. So you've got things like reverses, phasers, repeats, final sim, stutter. That's not a thing on the circuit tracks, although because of its connectivity, which I'm finally going to get into, it's got plenty of live performance features of its own. So let me show you that now. These are the ins and outs of the circuit tracks. And to be honest, they will look very similar on the rhythm. I've got this cable here just because I've got a mono output running into my audio interface so I can record both circuits so you can hear what I'm doing. So you've got stereo outputs. You've got 2 separate inputs, line inputs. You've got a headphone jack, a sync in and out, and then a MIDI in, out, and through. And you've also got the USB-C port for charging and the micro SD card for holding packs. So let's talk about these inputs. They're showing as input 1 and 2 on the circuit tracks, and they're showing as left/mono and right on the circuit rhythm. Now, I should mention, for those of you unfamiliar with how the circuits deal with samples, on both of these circuits, samples get collapsed down to mono. So I'm not exactly sure why they felt the need to give you stereo inputs if it's just going to get collapsed down to mono when you sample something into the circuit rhythm, other than you want to make sure that you get everything, and it's like they had the space for an input, so it's like may as well, I guess. I'm not Novation. I don't know exactly why they did that, but I have those slightly educated guesses. Regardless, here is the difference in the way that those inputs behave, because that's the important part. The circuit tracks cannot record into itself. That's not a thing it's set up to do, nor is it intended to be, because that's not the point of these inputs. The point of these inputs is that you would connect a synth or two synths to the circuit tracks and then control those synths using MIDI 1 and MIDI 2. In terms of behavior, they will behave pretty much exactly like Synth 1 and Synth 2. You can program notes into them, chord progressions, melodies, bass lines, all that kind of stuff. You can sidechain them to the drum tracks, and you can send them to the reverb and delay. So these control your external synths, and I'll show you an audio example of that in a second here. You use MIDI 1 and 2 to control your external hardware synths via MIDI, via the MIDI ports that I just showed you, and then you bring the audio of those external synths back into the circuit tracks via input 1 and 2. And input 1 is mapped to MIDI 1, and input 2 is mapped to MIDI 2. The circuit tracks is not only the controller for your external gear, it's also the mixer for your external gear. So you could do something like sidechain your external synth to the kick. That's super nice. And these knobs, these macro knobs, will now send MIDI CCs to your external devices. So you can control parameters of your external devices based on what you set up on the circuit tracks by itself. So it basically is the brain of a full DAW-less hardware jamming setup, which is awesome. And that's really what I go out of my way to use it for. It makes working with multiple devices super streamlined, simple, and immediate. And that's what I meant when I said that the connectivity of the circuit tracks is what really makes it stand out for live jamming. If you've got a bigger hardware setup that you want to use, this is a super clean, intuitive way to do it. Just don't expect to be able to use the inputs to sample directly into the circuit tracks. They're there for working with external gear in real time. And that's the key to understanding the way that the circuit tracks is. So here's an example of me using the circuit tracks with two external synths. So I've got Synth 1 and Synth 2 doing stuff, and MIDI 1 and MIDI 2 controlling synths and then processing that audio with the circuit. The inputs of the circuit rhythm function a little more how people expected them to. They can sample sounds directly into the rhythm. They can record stuff, essentially. Now, the sample time on the circuit rhythm is frustratingly short. It just can't hold that much. Like, it can hold a lot, but definitely don't expect to be able to record full instrument parts in this thing and layer stuff that way. That's probably not happening. But you can sample stuff into the circuit. So I will often just grab one of my external synths or drum machines, design a few sounds, and then just record them all into the circuit rhythm, and then I can access them just like any other pack. And if you do record something a bit longer into the circuit rhythm, you can also chop that up like I showed you earlier. So maybe you sample something off your phone, sample something from vinyl, or play in a quick little chord progression and then chop up those chords so that you can play chords on this thing, sort of. One other cool bonus of the recording feature on the circuit rhythm is not related to these inputs, but it's the fact that you can actually resample the circuit. So if you've got a cool beat that you want to flip yourself, you can absolutely do that. For instance, here's a beat I made on the rhythm. And then what I did was I muted the kick and the 808 and then resampled this. Then I was able to chop it up and flip it into this kind of vapor trap thing. And build a new 808 bass part around it. Now, the circuit rhythm does have MIDI ports, so it can be used to control external gear, and you can monitor the sound of external gear through the circuit rhythm. So theoretically, you can use it kind of like the circuit tracks. Like, you could use the inputs for a bit more of a live purpose, but those inputs couldn't be processed by, say, the master effects or by Sidechain. They're just kind of there untouched. So you probably want to use the circuit tracks if you want to sequence external gear and mix it all in one device. And because every single track on the circuit rhythm is monophonic, That unfortunately applies to sequencing external gear as well. It's only monophonic. So if you have a polysynth, you're not going to be able to like play chords on this thing and have that translate because it's just not set up to be polyphonic at all. So mono out only. You could get creative with it. Like if your synth has a chord mode, you could trigger different chords that way. That'd be kind of cool. But overall, I like both of these devices quite a bit. I've used something like the circuit tracks for a lot longer because I was a hardcore user of the original circuit long before this channel was at the subscriber level it's at, and long before Novation ever even thought to contact me. So the circuit tracks is definitely familiar, and I love the expansion of integrating external synths into itself. It basically single-handedly got me into the whole table full of gear DAW-less setup thing, because before that I just wasn't interested in that at all. On the other hand, the Circuit Rhythm has the unlimited sound palette, and it's like slightly more intuitive, I feel. Maybe that's just because every track behaves the same, and so it's super flexible. Regardless, these days I find myself reaching for the Circuit Rhythm by default just a little bit more than the circuit tracks, but nothing will ever make me abandon my circuit tracks. You don't need both. Let me be clear about that. Once again, I'm not trying to sell you anything. You don't need to own both of these, and after seeing all this, you might decide that neither is quite right for you. Some people might say that Novation intentionally nerfed both devices to keep them separate. I'm guessing that there are some technical limitations that made these trade-offs at least somewhat necessary, at least to keep the costs down, but once again, I'm not a software engineer, I don't know that for sure. But regardless, I enjoy having both, I enjoy using both, but you don't need to own both. Hopefully, this gives you a pretty solid idea of which one has the features and limitations that you're happy to live with. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you once again to Novation for sponsoring this video. If you'd like to see more music production gear comparisons, you can click or tap up over here, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit. Peace.